Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. This is the Gangs of Toronto Part 2 video. And as a quick note before I get started, all information in this video is based on publicly available information, and this is intended to just be a general overview for people interested in the subject. If you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee, and the link to that is in the description of this video. I'm also working on a Patreon account where I have some extra content. This will be ready in a few weeks. It'll be another way you can support the channel, and I'll let you know when that's done. At any rate, thank you for watching. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to get started with this video because I have a lot of ground to cover in this one. And I'm going to start by going back in time to the 1800s. Toronto has had many criminal organizations over the years. And I'm going to start with the Brooks Bush Gang. This was a mixed-gendered group of thieves and desperados that was active from the 1850s to the 1860s. They were based in a wooded area east of the Don River, although the exact location is a bit unclear. In January of 1855, Sergeant McCaffrey of Toronto received word that the eastern end of the city was, quote, infested by a number of depraved young females who lived more like brutes than human beings, end quote. Sergeant McCaffrey then traveled to this area and found a group of young women and men living rough in the woods, and their ages ranged from 12 or 13 years old to about 20 years old. Sergeant McCaffrey then arrested several members of the group. 4 men received fines and 7 women received jail time. In August of 1856, the Globe newspaper described Brooks Bush as, quote, being infected with a horde of the most dangerous characters of both sexes, and has become such a prodigious public nuisance that coercive means must be adopted to rid the place of the gang of plunderers from whom life nor property are safe, end quote. Later that year, 10 more members of the gang were arrested. They had a reputation for robbing and assaulting people who crossed through this area. Women played a prominent leadership role in this group, which was relatively rare when looking at Canadian gangs from this era. A woman named Jane Ward, who is described as a vicious English prostitute, was born in Yorkshire, England, and moved to Canada at an early age. She eventually joined the Brooks Bush Gang and became quite prominent, gaining a reputation as the Bandit Queen of Riverdale. She was known to have 2 vices, tobacco and cheap whiskey. And here is a quote describing Jane Ward, quote, she was rarely seen in public without a pipe in her lips and trailing a haze of smoke from the cheapest and strongest tobacco she could find, end quote. Another prominent woman in the gang was Yankee Mary. She was described as having a frail character, and she was arrested for getting a retired militiaman drunk and robbing him of his clothes and possessions. In July of 1856, a, quote, colored boy named Isaiah Sewell was murdered near Brooks Bush. A man named Michael Berry was at Brooks Bush at the time of the murder, but he did not seem to have been part of the gang officially. Michael Berry would eventually be found guilty of manslaughter in Sewell's death, and the Brooks Bush gang would boast for years about this murder. Michael Berry apparently called Sewell a, quote, black beggar as he struck him in the head with a bottle, killing him. Historian Joan Doucette suggested that this was the first racially motivated murder in Toronto and possibly Ontario. In December of 1859, a man named John Sheridan Hogan went missing. Mr. Hogan was a former journalist who is now serving as a member of Parliament, and his sudden disappearance was a mystery. His body was eventually found washed up at the mouth of the Don River in March of 1861, about 16 months after he disappeared, and the Brooks Bush Gang was thought to have been involved in his death. A member of the gang named Ellen McGillick was present when Mr. Hogan was murdered, and she would testify against the gang. She said that the gang had robbed Mr. Hogan, tied his legs together, and threw him off the Don Bridge. At the trial for this murder in April of 1861, John Sherrick and Jane Ward of the Brooks Bush Gang were acquitted, but gang member James Brown was found guilty. Mr. Brown was eventually hung in front of spectators on March 10th of 1862, and this was the last public execution in Toronto. After the highly publicized Hogan trial, mentions of the Brooks Bush Gang dwindled, and this event seemed to signal the end of this group. Individual members would pop up in news reports for a bit, but the Brooks Bush Gang would soon come to an end. However, this gang carved out a name for themselves, and they are considered to be one of Toronto's most prominent criminal organizations of the 1800s. Now I'm going to talk about the Markham Gang. This group was formed in the early 1840s, and they evolved from organizations founded to support the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837. Unlike the Brooks Bush Gang, the Markham Gang was made up primarily of fairly wealthy farm owners and their families. They were highly organized and used a private communications network of couriers across what was then Canada West. They would conduct reconnaissance missions on future victims, noting where money and valuables were located throughout the community. Members of the gang were sworn to secrecy by oath to protect each other. They would often steal items and then sell them in Canada East, where they would be exchanged for counterfeit money. There are a couple defining events in the history of the gang that ultimately led to their downfall. First, on November 7th of 1845, several high-ranking members of the gang burst into the home of local farmer John Morrow, badly assaulting Mr. Morrow and his wife and robbing them of money. 1920. The 4 men who had committed the robbery were quickly arrested, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. These were commuted to life sentences at Kingston Penitentiary, but the men were eventually released and pardoned in 1853, long after the gang had been dissolved. The second major event occurred on November 20th of 1846. A man named William McPhillips, who was manager of Logan's General Store in Markham, was found dead after apparently being beaten with a hammer the night before. Stephen Turney of the Markham Gang was eventually arrested and convicted of this murder. He was later hanged in Toronto in June of 1847, and this hanging ultimately spelled the end for this gang. As other members were being released from jail, they took up honest pursuits, with many claiming that they had lost more money than they could have ever made honestly. And to this day, the Markham Gang remains a prominent criminal organization in Toronto's underworld history. Another group from this time period was the Rideouts Bush Gang. Like the Brooks Bush Gang, this was also primarily made up of young women, and some have suggested that the two gangs were connected. The gang was first mentioned publicly in June of 1859 when a group of, quote, unfortunates, consisting of Maria Reed, Mary Shepherd, Catherine O'Brien, Harriet LaGrasse, Mary Martin, and Ellen MacDonald were, quote, charged with conducting themselves in a disorderly manner in the bush in the rear of Mr. Rideout's residence, head of Sherbourne Street. Sergeant Major Cummings of Toronto traveled to this area with a team of constables and apprehended the girls, giving them a sentence of 1 month in jail each. Like the Brooks Bush group, the Rideouts Bush Gang was thought to have been involved in robberies and assaults throughout Toronto, particularly the north and east sides of the city. As I mentioned, in June of 1862, following the final Hogan trial and public execution of James Brown, the police had effectively disbanded the Brooks Bush Gang. Some former members of that gang began hanging out in Rideouts Bush, and this area started gaining the same notoriety as Brooks Bush. This is a quote from the Globe from June 1st of 1863. Quote, "This gang is becoming quite notorious, and if it be not soon completely broken up and dispersed, will in all likelihood finish its career by some scheme of villainy equal to that of the late Brooks Bush party." In September of 1864, Toronto police came upon a group of troublemakers who were, quote, holding high carnival at Rideouts Bush near Sherbourne Street. They found 7 people, quote, in the midst of a riotous mirth, and their conduct was disgraceful in the extreme. 4 women and 3 men were arrested and sentenced to hard labor in jail. The Rideouts Bush Gang seemed to disappear from the historical records after the fall of 1864. Unlike the Brooks Bush and Markham gangs, they were not linked to a high-profile violent crime, and it seems that this gang quietly ceased their mischief and disbanded, but they definitely deserve a mention when talking about gangs in the city during the 1800s. Now I'm going to move forward in time a bit. So shortly after World War II, during the mid to late 1940s, a number of youth gangs popped up around Toronto, and the public gathering of rowdy and troublemaking youth and young adults was becoming more of a common occurrence. On October 31st of 1945, an enormous party of teenagers filled a section of Queen Street East in the Beaches area of Toronto. One police officer estimated that 7,000 people were gathered at this party. Things got pretty rowdy. Huge bonfires were started in the middle of the road, blocking streetcars. Fences were torn down and used to feed these fires, and obstacles were put up to prevent fire trucks from accessing this area. Police on horseback began clubbing the crowd, and police arrested 2 youth and drove off with them. This greatly angered the crowd, and they marched north to the Main Street police station chanting, "Release them, release them." As the crowd surrounded the police station, police and firemen turned fire hoses on the crowd. This angered the group further, and they began throwing debris at the police and firemen. A police captain was quoted as saying, "I never saw so many rocks and pieces of concrete flying through the air at one time." The crowd eventually dispersed, but this event would come to be known as the Halloween Riot and highlighted the rise of violent and rowdy youth in Toronto following the Second World War. There were a number of youth gangs present at this time. You had the Tips Gang, the Junction Boys, the Balmy Beach Gang, the Boone Avenue Gang, and the Beanery Boys. These were largely made up of kids whose fathers had served in the war and whose mothers were busy working, and they were largely left to their own devices. Idle hands are the devil's plaything, and these kids formed gangs and started making trouble throughout the city. One of the most prominent street gangs of this era was the Beanery Gang, or the Beanery Boys. Members ranged from about 18 to 22 years old. They uniformly dressed in zoot suit pants, loud shirts which were often partly unbuttoned, long and well-greased hair, and bomber jackets. The Beanery Boys entered the public eye in early July of 1948, when police found a cache of homemade weapons in a hayloft near Lake Wilcox and arrested several self-confessed gang members. This gang quickly developed a reputation around the city. According to their unwritten code, members had to be able to give and take severe punishment, and they could never betray a fellow member. They were known to frequently get drunk, pick fights with civilians and other rival gangs, gangs, commit robberies, and steal cars. Their headquarters was a burger joint near the corner of Dovercourt Road and College Street in West Toronto, otherwise known as the Beanery. They gained a lot of publicity on August 21st of 1948, when they were involved in a massive brawl with a tip gang at Wasaga Beach. A large number of the Beanery Boys were hanging out in this area when suddenly a bunch of the tip gang arrived in truckloads with the intention of fighting with the Beanery Boys. At around 11 p.m. on August 21st, close to 100 people on both sides kicked off a massive and bloody brawl near Davies Dancing Club. Apart from the main fight, smaller groups split off from the main group and started looting stores and randomly attacking bystanders. A man named J.R. Murray, a mild-mannered visitor from Cleveland, Ohio, was jumped by 15 rowdies as he sat on the porch of the Wasaga Inn enjoying a quiet drink with friends. He was left with a bruised jaw and a couple of missing teeth, and he told reporters that, quote, he never knew Canada was like this. The local Wasaga police were completely overwhelmed and had to call for reinforcements from Barrie, Collingwood, and Elmville. The combined police forces eventually subdued the two gangs around 3 a.m. and 13 youths were jailed for a variety of charges. 18-year-old Frank Struthers, described as the deputy leader of the Beanery Gang, broke down in tears when he was in court. By the end of 1948, the gang had more or less been dissolved. However, to this day, they remain a legendary group in Toronto's gang history, and they had many similarities to the Zoot Suit gangs of the same era in cities like Vancouver. Now I'm going to move on to the Boyd Gang. So this group was formed by notorious Toronto criminal Edwin Alonzo Boyd. Ed Boyd was born in Toronto in 1914 and committed a variety of crimes in his younger years, even serving time in Saskatchewan's Prince Albert Penitentiary when he was 22. He served during World War II, and upon returning from the war, he was unable to secure adequate employment, and so he turned to crime to support himself and his family. On September 9th of 1949, he robbed his first bank, a Toronto branch of the Bank of Montreal, with a German Luger handgun. Between September of 1949 and October of 1951, Ed pulled off at least 6 more bank robberies. Ed Boyd would link up with another local thief named Howard Galt, and they would commit several robberies together. Howard would eventually be arrested for the robberies, and he would identify Edwin as his accomplice. And both Edwin and Howard would be sentenced to the Don Jail in Toronto. While he was incarcerated at the Don Jail, Edwin Boyd would meet Willie and Lenny Jackson, who were not related. These two men also had experience robbing banks. Lenny Jackson had lost a foot in a railway accident and had a wooden foot in which he stored hacksaw blades. On November 4th of 1951, Boyd and the Jacksons used these hacksaw blades to saw through the bars of the prison and escape. After escaping from prison, Edwin Boyd and the Jacksons would team up with their friend Valent Lesso, who would later change his name to Steve Suchin. This newly formed gang would commit a string of bank robberies, including the largest one in Toronto's history. The newspapers saw Edwin Boyd as the brains of the operation and dubbed the group the Boyd Gang. On March 6 of 1952, Detective Sergeant Edmund Tong and his partner Sergeant Roy Perry stopped Lenny Jackson and Steve Suchin in their car as they were driving. Suchin shot his pistol and shot both him and Sergeant Perry in the police car. Sergeant Perry was wounded in the arm, and Sergeant Tong died of his injuries a few weeks later. Lenny and Willie Jackson, along with Steve Suchin, would later be arrested in Montreal after a shootout with police that left both Larry and Steve wounded. Edwin Boyd was later arrested separately in Toronto for the bank robberies. All 4 men were placed in side-by-side cells in the Don Jail, and on September 8th of 1952, the 4 men managed to escape prison for a second time using tools that had been smuggled in by a lawyer. That night, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's first television newscast, anchored by Lorne Green, detailed the escape of the 4 bank robbers. The warden of the jail was suspended over this incident, and a $27,000 reward was offered for information leading to their arrest. 10 days later, the Jacksons and Steve Suchin were discovered hiding in a barn a mile north of Shepherd Avenue and Leslie Street. Edwin Boyd was later arrested at his brother's house in the middle of the night. He had been hiding there with his wife. At dawn on March 15th of 1952, police crept inside the house and arrested Boyd, who was still in bed with his wife, and Boyd's brother was also apprehended. The Toronto Nugget reported the event, stating, quote, Edwin Alonzo Boyd, Canada's public enemy #1, surrendered with his henchmen to 2 suburban detectives, ending the greatest criminal manhunt in the Dominion's history. With the 4 members of the gang once again in jail, security was tightened and they would not escape again. Lenny Jackson and Steve Suchin were tried for the murder of Sergeant Tong earlier that year. Both were found guilty and sentenced to death. They were executed in a double hanging at the Don Jail in December of 1952. 1962. Willie Jackson was sentenced to 31 years for the bank robberies, and Edwin Boyd was sentenced to 8 life terms plus 27 years concurrently. Willie Jackson and Edwin Boyd both served their terms at Kingston Penitentiary, and Jackson was released on parole in 1966. Edwin Boyd was released in 1962, but returned to prison for 4 more years due to parole violations. After being released from prison, he moved to Victoria, BC, where he drove a bus for disabled people. After divorcing his first wife, he married a disabled woman who he had met driving the bus. He took care of her for decades until they both moved into a retirement home. 2 months before his death, Edwin Boyd confessed to a CBC producer that he once killed a couple and left their bodies in the trunk of a car in High Park, Toronto, years before his career as a bank robber. Before a formal investigation into this confession could begin, Edwin Boyd died on May 17th of 2002 at age 88. 2 books have been written on the Boyd gang, and a film based on his life called Citizen Gangster was released in 2011. And the Boyd gang is definitely worth mentioning when you're looking at prominent criminal organization in Toronto's past. Now I'm going to cover some of the outlaw motorcycle clubs that have been active in Toronto. These groups generally started out as riding clubs, but over time became involved in criminal activity, and it's reasonable to classify most of them as gangs. And I'm going to start with the Black Diamond Riders Motorcycle Club. This group was founded by a man named Harry Paul Barnes, also known as Johnny Sombrero. Harry Barnes was born in Toronto in 1935 to a British father and an Italian mother. In fact, his mother was related to the 'Ndrangheta, which is an Italian mafia-type organization based in Calabria, Italy. And throughout his criminal career, Harry Barnes benefited from these connections. In the late 1940s, Barnes joined a biker gang called the Humber Valley Riders, but he broke away in 1951 to found his own gang called the Black Diamond Riders. The club quickly became the dominant motorcycle club in Toronto during the 1950s. The club would get into massive brawls with other clubs in the city, particularly on Queen Street. Peter Edwards, who was the crime correspondent of the Toronto Star, wrote, quote, "Some fights were so ferocious that Queen Street in Toronto had to be blocked off to accommodate the young thugs." End quote. In 1956, Harry Barnes declared a biker war on the first version of the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club, accusing them of threatening Black Diamond Riders' turf. And this is a quote from Harry Barnes, quote, "The first time I invaded their clubhouse, I had to. They were invading our property." End quote. Black Diamond Riders members would assault Satan's Choice members and steal their patches, eventually forcing the first version of that club to disband, although they would later be revived, and I'll get into that later. In 1961, Harry Barnes first met Bernie the Frog Guindon of the Golden Hawk Riders, and apparently this meeting ended badly when Guindon refused to address Barnes as, quote, "Supreme Commander." In 1962, the infamous Battle of Pebblestone occurred at the Pebblestone Golf Course in the village of Cordis, where different clubs were having a biker field day where they were showing off their bikes to the public. Barnes and the Black Diamond Riders violated the biker code by attacking various bikers at this event, and Harry Barnes personally fought Bernie Guindon at this brawl, and this conflict would make Barnes famous in Toronto. The American journalist Mick Lowe wrote that, quote, "The Battle of Pebblestone sent a chill through all of the Toronto area clubs." In 1965, to stand up against attacks of the Black Diamond Riders, Bernie Guindon organized the merger of 4 separate motorcycle clubs into the newly revived Satan's Choice. The Satan's Choice now greatly outnumbered the Black Diamond Riders, and used this newfound superiority to beat the club in a number of brawls across the GTA from 1965 to 1966. At the conclusion of this conflict, Bernie Guindon imposed new boundaries on the Black Diamond Riders, giving them a small area of Toronto while taking the rest for Satan's Choice. After losing the biker war to the Satan's Choice, the Black Diamond Riders dwindled, going from about 200 members in 1963 to about 15 members in 1968. A 1973 report by the Ontario Provincial Police listed the Black Diamond Riders as being marginal players in Toronto's drug market. In the early 90s, this club had a resurgence and planned to found a chapter in Sudbury, which was viewed as a threat by Bernie Guindon. During the Labor Day weekend in 1992, there was a large brawl in the parking lot of the Sorrento Motor Hotel in Sudbury, where Harry Barnes and 6 other Black Diamond Riders were beaten up by Guindon, along with 44 other Satan's Choice bikers armed with guns, knives, and baseball bats. This brawl came to be known as the Sudbury Saturday Night in biker circles. After this brawl, the Black Diamond Riders began to fade into irrelevance. The Black Diamond Riders have been described as no longer being involved with crime. Harry Barnes died in 2016, but the club is still around, although their activities were very low-key. And then of course you had the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. This is another outlaw club that originated in the Toronto area. At one time, they were the second largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world, behind only the Hells Angels. The first iteration of the club formed around 1956 in Toronto, and they were known to hang out at a downtown restaurant called Ada's. The president of this club was Don Norris, and the club was mostly social with a non-criminal focus. But they quickly found themselves at odds with the Black Diamond Riders Club, and as I previously mentioned, after multiple brawls with that larger club, which included members having their patches stolen at gunpoint, they were forced to disband in 1962. Following the Battle of Pebblestone, where Black Diamond Riders attacked other bikers, Bernie Guindon sought vengeance on the club. In 1965, Guindon organized a merger of 4 separate clubs in order to fight back against the Black Diamond Riders: the Phantom Riders of Oshawa, the Canadian Lancers of Scarborough, the Throttle Twisters of Preston, and the Wild Ones of Port Credit. Guindon sought and received permission from Don Norris to use the name and patch of the former Satan's Choice, and so the newly formed Satan's Choice was officially established. Later that year, Toronto filmmaker Donald Shabib produced a film featuring this club titled Satan's Choice, which greatly increased their exposure in Toronto. One of the first members of Satan's Choice was prominent Canadian gangster Lorne Campbell. Initially, they were not involved with organized crime, but they frequently became involved in violent brawls. On September 25th of 1967, Guindon held the first national convention of Satan's Choice at a farmhouse just outside of Toronto. This convention was attended by Satan's Choice members from their chapters in Oshawa, Ottawa, St. Catharines, Windsor, Montreal, Preston, Kingston, Peterborough, and Hamilton. This convention was raided by 23 police officers who soon retreated after being outnumbered, and they had to walk back to the police station after their cruisers were trashed. The police returned later that night in greater numbers and arrested 55 bikers and smashed their bikes in retaliation. Journalists at the scene the following morning described it as looking like a war zone. This event was highly publicized around Toronto, and the court proceedings that followed attracted large crowds of people. Public opinion seemed to be on the sides of the bikers, who were believed to be victims of excessive force by the police. By the end of the 1960s, Guindon had become a sort of folk hero in Toronto, and Satan's Choice had become the largest outlaw biker club in Canada, reaching a peak strength of about 400 members in 1969. Satan's Choice slowly developed into an organized criminal group involved in everything from robbery and theft to prostitution and drug trafficking. Former Satan's Choice member and prominent Canadian gangster Cecil Kirby wrote in his memoirs entitled Mafia Enforcer that Satan's Choice members would develop relationships with the female clerks who operated the Ontario Provincial Police computers, and they would provide the club with valuable information. This intelligence network solidified the club's dominance against rival groups, but Ontario police would soon increase their efforts against the club. In 1973, the intelligence branch of the OPP set up the special squad to combat bikers in the province. OPP Corporal Terry Hall called the campaign against the Satan's Choice reverse intimidation, which sought to intimidate the bikers using the same methods as the bikers used, and he was known to use ruthless and illegal methods against the biker clubs. Terry Hall would leak information to journalists portraying the Satan's Choice as public enemy number 1, and this campaign definitely weakened the club. Satan's Choice had 400 members in 1969, but by 1977 it was down to about 110. In 1975, Bernie Guindon formed an alliance with the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, the oldest outlaw biker club in the world and one of the largest international clubs in the world. The Outlaws were formed in 1935 in the Chicago area and over time have spread internationally. Currently, they are the 3rd largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world, behind only the Hells Angels and the Bandidos. And during the 1970s, the Outlaws were pushing to establish a foothold in Canada. And when Bernie Guindon formed an alliance with the Outlaws in 1975, this gave the Satan's Choice access to a larger network of clubs throughout the US. In May of 1976, Satan's Choice president Bernie Guindon was jailed on drug charges, and a man named Garnet McEwen took over as president. McEwen favored close ties with the Outlaws, unlike Guindon, who was a staunch Canadian nationalist and very resistant to being taken over by a club from the US. This led to a massive fracturing of the club in 1977. The Satan's Choice chapters in Montreal, Hamilton, St. Catharines, Sault Ste. Marie, Windsor, London, Ottawa, and Kingston all patched over to the Outlaws Club. This led to Bernie Guindon developing a long-standing grudge against the Outlaws. When Guindon was released from prison in 1984, the only remaining Satan's Choice chapters were Thunder Bay, Kitchener, Oshawa, and Toronto. By the 1980s, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club had effectively supplanted the Satan's Choice as the most powerful club in Ontario. In 1981, Satan's Choice formed alliances with the Lobos and the Chosen Few gangs to strengthen the club against their new rivals, the Outlaws. And by the 1980s, Satan's Choice had established a pipeline pipeline that moved cocaine from Ontario to Alberta. And between 1985 and 1989, Gindin opened up 4 new chapters in Ontario. As I mentioned previously, in 1994, Satan's Choice members were involved in the massive Sudbury Saturday night brawl against the outnumbered Black Diamond Riders, who were attempting to set up a new chapter in Sudbury. Throughout the 90s, Satan's Choice would be approached by the Hells Angels several times offering a friendly takeover, but this was ultimately resisted by Bernie Gindin. In 1995, Satan's Choice made an alliance with the Diablos, which was led by former Satan's Choice member Frank Lenti. During the summer of that year, under pressure from the Hells Angels, the Diablos came into conflict with the Loners Motorcycle Club, and they quickly called upon the Satan's Choice for assistance in this conflict. This led to a major biker conflict which involved the use of Molotov cocktails and explosives. One dramatic event during this conflict occurred on August 1st of that year. The Loners would use a military rocket launcher to hit the Satan's Choice clubhouse in Toronto. Later that same month, Diablos leader Frank Lenti was badly wounded by a car bomb, and his hospitalization led to the collapse of the Diablos and the end of this biker war. This was highly publicized throughout Toronto and even led to an unsuccessful attempt by Toronto Mayor Barbara Hall to purchase the Satan's Choice clubhouse in an attempt to shut down this gang. In 1996, Gindin retired as Satan's Choice president but remained a member. That same year saw the club targeted by a major police organization dubbed Project Dismantle. This involved 300 officers from the OPP as well as the municipal police forces of Toronto, Halton, Durham, Hamilton, Wentworth, Waterloo, and Sudbury. This operation led to the arrest of over 160 people associated with Satan's Choice and the seizure of millions of dollars in cash and drugs as well as a variety of firearms. This operation greatly weakened the club, cutting their membership in half by 1998. And then finally on December 29th of 2000, the Satan's Choice officially patched over to the Hells Angels, who had slowly been taking over Canada as the dominant outlaw motorcycle club in the country. In July of 2017, a new motorcycle club identifying themselves as Satan's Choice emerged in Ontario using the same patch. National Secretary of the Hells Angels, Donnie Peterson, attacked this new club on Facebook. Quote, "Those who take a patch from a respected club, one that has courage, history, who has paid their dues, done time, and all the rest, what are you thinking? You are pretenders." End quote. It is thought that this club disbanded shortly after this, and so Satan's Choice remains a major gang in Toronto's history, and at one time they were the second largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world, and they definitely established a notorious reputation in Canada's largest city. Now I'll talk about the Loners Motorcycle Club. This is another Toronto area group that was established by former members of Satan's Choice. Prominent Canadian gangsters Frank Lenti and Gennaro or Jimmy Rosso were former members of Satan's Choice, and they left that club in 1978. The two men were involved in starting a chapter of the Alberta-based Rebels Motorcycle Club in Toronto, and later formed a new club called the Loners in 1979. In 1981, Frank Lenti was kicked out of the club and moved to Italy, but while he was there, he persuaded other motorcycle clubs to join the Loners, and he also established several new chapters. Frank Lenti eventually returned to the Loners in Canada in 1984, and all of the new chapters he set up in Italy were officially recognized. At some point during the 1980s, the Loners established a chapter in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, but this club would eventually patch over to the Alberta-based Rebels. By the late 1980s, the Loners had chapters in the United States, several chapters in Ontario, multiple chapters in Italy, and a chapter in Portugal. Frank Lenti would be kicked out of the Loners Club a second time in 1994, and he would go on to found a new club called the Diablos. As I mentioned earlier, the Diablos would form an alliance with Satan's Choice in 1995, and there was a major biker war between the Loners and the allied Diablos and Satan's Choice, which saw the heavy use of explosives and massive media coverage in Toronto. The Loners emerged victorious after this war and remained a prominent Toronto biker club. In 1997, the Loners split into two factions. A split emerged between leaders Jimmy Rosso and Frank Grano. The pro-Hells Angels faction led by Grano joined the Paradise Riders while the rest remained under Jimmy Rosso. In June of 1999, the Loners absorbed the Annihilators Motorcycle Club, which was led by prominent Canadian gangsters Wayne Kellenstein and Giovanni Macedre. The Loners would be involved in the infamous Ontario Biker War of 1999 to 2002. You could do a whole video on this conflict alone, but it essentially saw the Hells Angels fighting against the Loners and the Outlaws for control of Ontario. The Hells Angels would of course ultimately emerge victorious in this conflict, but the Loners remained a prominent outlaw motorcycle club in the province. Many members of the Loners patched over to the Bandidos in 2001. The Bandidos are another large outlaw motorcycle club that was formed in Texas in the 1960s. The Bandidos have hundreds of chapters worldwide, and they're actually the second largest motorcycle club in the world behind the Hells Angels. In 2007, several members of the Loners joined another California-based motorcycle club called the Mongols. Despite all these setbacks, the Loners would continue to grow and expand throughout the 2000s. By the end of that decade, the Loners had opened several new chapters in Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, as well as in several other countries in Europe and Oceania. Starting in 2011, the Loners found themselves in conflict with the Vagos Motorcycle Club, a California-based club that had set up a new chapter in the Toronto area. This led to open conflict between the two clubs over the next couple years, and during this period, the Loners had patched over the Vigilantes Club, giving them a significant advantage over the Vagos. And this conflict would come to an end when the Vagos patched over to the Outlaws in 2015. Historically, the Outlaws had decent relations with the Loners, however, this would start to change in the 2020s. In August of 2022, 3 members of the Outlaws were arrested in what authorities said was a conflict with the Loners. In July of 2023, there was a large altercation between 30 members of the Outlaws and Loners in Cornwall that resulted in multiple injuries. A couple days later, the Outlaws' Brockville clubhouse experienced a massive fire, and authorities said this fire was suspicious and that the Loners were suspected in this case. The next day, the Loners' Brockville clubhouse was also hit with arson. These events surprised local law enforcement as the two clubs were traditionally more friendly, for example being allies in the Ontario Biker War. As of 2023, the club has an estimated 1,000 members worldwide. They have over 65 chapters in 13 countries on multiple continents, and they are still active in the Toronto area. But currently, as you may have guessed, the dominant outlaw motorcycle club in Toronto is the Hells Angels. This started as a riding club in California in the late 1940s and quickly developed into the largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world, and according to authorities, a sophisticated international criminal organization. The first Hells Angels charter in Canada was founded in Montreal in December of 1977 when a motorcycle club called the Popeyes patched over to the Hells Angels, and I'll talk about the Popeyes in the Gangs of Montreal videos. Over time, the Hells Angels spread across Canada, establishing new charters and absorbing smaller clubs, but it was in Ontario that they faced the most resistance to expansion, due to the strength of clubs like Satan's Choice and the Outlaws. But eventually in 2000, Hells Angels national president Walter Stadnick helped facilitate a mass patchover of multiple smaller clubs in Ontario. On December 29th of 2000, at a Hells Angels clubhouse in Montreal, members of Satan's Choice, the Paradise Riders, the Last Chance, the Lobos, and the Rock Machine joined the Hells Angels, making them in one stroke the dominant biker gang in Ontario. Interestingly, the Hells Angels were initially embraced by the political and business elites in Toronto. This is best symbolized by an incident in January of 2002 when Toronto Mayor Mel Lastman was photographed shaking hands with a member of the Hells Angels at one of the club's gatherings, telling media that the motorcycle club were, quote, a nice bunch of guys, end quote. But obviously over time they have been involved with just about every sort of organized crime enterprise you could imagine. The Hells Angels have had many operations launched against them using significant information gathered by informants. In April of 2003, the OPP launched Project Shirley, which used information gathered by a waitress turned informant, and this saw multiple Hells Angels members arrested across the Greater Toronto area in connection with a drug smuggling route from Montreal to Toronto. In September of 2006, the OPP launched Project Tandem after an 18-month investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. Around 500 officers and 21 tactical teams raided property across Ontario, and multiple Hells Angels were arrested. Project Tandem was made possible by recruiting Stephen Galt, treasurer of the Hells Angels Oshawa charter, to serve as informer. Stephen Galt was believed to have been the first full-patch Hells Angels member to wear a wire for police. David Atwell, the sergeant-at-arms of the Hells Angels downtown Toronto charter, also became a police informant, and in April of 2007, police launched Project Develop after an 18-month investigation that was made possible by information provided by Atwell. Multiple Hells Angels members in Toronto were arrested, and police seized over $3 million in drugs. And although they face pressure from other criminal organizations and constant police countermeasures, the Hells Angels remain the dominant motorcycle club in the Greater Toronto area. And that pretty much wraps up the Gangs of Toronto Part 2 video. And I probably could have done an hour-long video for some of the groups that I mentioned, but I wanted this to be more of a general overview. Again, if you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee, and the link to that is in the description. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and if you got some value out of this one, please give it a like. This really helps me out. And if you'd like to watch more of my videos in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I typically upload something new at least once a week. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.